Edward, his Majesty withdrew, and, turning his horse's head, he made all haste to leave Worcester. After several hours' riding, the King found himself in company of about 4,000 of the cavalry who had so disgracefully fled, but they were still so panic-struck that he could put no confidence in them, and having advised with those about him, he resolved to quit them. This he did without mentioning his intention to any of his staff, not even Chaloner or Edward, leaving at night with 2 of his servants, whom he dismissed as soon as it was daylight, considering that his chance of escape would be greater if he were quite alone. It was not till the next morning that they discovered that the King had left them, and then they determined to separate, and, as the major portion were from Scotland, to make what haste they could back to that country. And now Chaloner and Edward consulted as to their plans. "It appears to me," said Edward, laughing, "that the danger of this campaign of ours will consist in getting back again to our own homes, for I can most safely assert that I have not yet struck a blow for the King." "That is true enough, Beverley. When do you propose going back to the New Forest?" "I think, if you will permit me, I will accompany you," said Chaloner. "All the pursuit will be to the northward, to intercept and overtake the retreat into Scotland. I cannot therefore go to Lancashire, and indeed, as they know that I am out, they will be looking for me everywhere." "Then come with me," said Edward. "I will find you protection till you can decide what to do. Let us ride on away from this, and we will talk over the matter as we go. But depend upon it, the further south we get, the safer we shall be, but still not safe unless we can change our costume. There will be a strict search for the King to the south, and they will presume that he will try to get safe to France. Hark! What is that? I heard the report of arms. Let us ride up this hill and see what is going on." They did so, and perceived that there was a skirmish between a party of cavaliers and some of the Parliamentary cavalry at about a quarter of a mile distant. "Come, Chaloner, let us at all events have one blow," said Edward. "Agreed," replied Chaloner, spurring his horse, and down they went at full speed, and in a minute were in the melee, coming on the rear of the Parliamentary troops. This sudden attack from behind decided the affair. The Parliamentary troopers, thinking that there were more than 2 coming upon them, made off after another minute's combat, leaving 5 or 6 of their men on the ground. "Thanks, Chaloner! Thanks, Beverley!" said a voice which they immediately recognized. It was that of Grenville, one of the King's pages. "These fellows with me were just about to run, if you had not come to our aid. I will remain with them no longer, but join you if you will permit me. At all events, remain here till they go away. I will send them off." Grenville then said to the men, "My lads, you must all separate, or there will be no chance of escape. No more than 2 should ride together. Depend upon it, we shall have more of the troops here directly." The men, about 15 in number, who had been in company with Grenville, considered that Chaloner's advice was good, and without ceremony set off, with their horses' heads to the northward, leaving Chaloner, Edward, and Grenville together on the field of the fray. About a dozen men were lying on the ground, either dead or severely wounded. 7 of them were of the King's party, and the other 5 of the Parliamentary troops. "Now, what I propose," said Edward, "is this. Let us do what we can for those who are wounded, and then strip off the dresses and accoutrements of those Parliamentary dragoons who are dead, and dress ourselves in them, accoutrements and all. We can then pass through the country in safety, as we shall be supposed to be one of the parties looking for the King." "That is a good idea," replied Chaloner, "and the sooner it is done the better." "Well," said Edward, wiping his sword, which he still held drawn, and then sheathing it, "I will take the spoils of this fellow nearest to me. He fell by my hand, and I am entitled to them by the laws of war and chivalry. But first let us dismount and look to the wounded." They tied their horses to a tree, and having given what assistance they could to the wounded men, they proceeded to strip 3 of the Parliamentary troopers, and then laying aside their own habiliments, they dressed themselves in the uniform of the enemy, and, mounting their horses, made all haste from the place. Having gained about 12 miles, they pulled up their horses, and rode at a more leisurely pace. It was now 8 o'clock in the evening, but still not very dark. They therefore rode on another 5 miles, till they came to a small village, where they dismounted at an alehouse and put their horses into the stable. "We must be insolent and brutal in our manners, or we shall be suspected." "Very true," said Grenville, giving the hostler a kick, and telling him to bestir himself, if he did not want his ears cropped. They entered the alehouse, and soon found out they were held in great terror. They ordered everything of the best to be produced, and threatened to set fire to the house if it was not. They turned the man and his wife out of their bed, and all 3 went to sleep in it, and in short they behaved in such an arbitrary manner that nobody doubted that they were Cromwell's horse. In the morning they set off again by Challoner's advice, paying for nothing that they had ordered, although they had all of them plenty of money. They now rode fast, inquiring at the places which they passed through whether any fugitives had been seen, and if they came to a town, inquiring before they entered whether there were any parliamentary troops. So well did they manage that after 4 days they had gained the skirts of the New Forest, and concealed themselves in a thicket till night time, when Edward proposed that he should conduct his fellow travellers to the cottage, where he would leave them till his plans were adjusted. Edward had already arranged his plans. His great object was to ward off any suspicion of where he had been, and of course any idea that the intendant had been a party to his acts, and the fortunate change of his dress enabled him now to do so with success. He had decided to conduct his two friends to the cottage that night, and the next morning to ride over in his parliamentary costume to the intendant's house, and bring the first news of the success of Cromwell and the defeat at Worcester, by which stratagem it would appear as if he had been with the parliamentary, and not with the Jacobite army. As they had travelled along, they found that the news of Cromwell's success had not yet arrived. In those times there was not the rapidity of communication that we have now, and Edward thought it very probable that he would be the first to communicate the intelligence to the intendant and those who resided near him. As soon as it was dusk the three travellers left their retreat, and, guided by Edward, soon arrived at the cottage. Their appearance at first created no little consternation, for Humphrey and Pablo happened to be in the yard when they heard the clattering of the swords and accouterments, and through the gloom observed, as they advanced, that the party were troopers. At first Humphrey was for running on and barring the door, but on a second reflection he felt that he could not do a more imprudent thing if there was danger, and he therefore contented himself with hastily imparting the intelligence to his sisters, and then remaining at the threshold to meet the coming of the parties. The voice of Edward calling him by name dissipated all alarm, and in another minute he was in the arms of his brother and sisters. "First let us take our horses to the stables, Humphrey," said Edward, after the first greeting was over, "and then we will come and partake of anything that Alice can prepare for us, for we have not fared over well for the last 3 days." Accompanied by Humphrey and Pablo, they all went to the stables, and turned out the ponies to make room for the horses, and as soon as they were all fed and littered down, they returned to the cottage, and Chaloner and Grenville were introduced. Supper was soon on the table, and they were too hungry to talk while they were eating, so that but little information was gleaned from them that night. However, Humphrey ascertained that all was lost, and that they had escaped from the field previous to Alice and Edith leaving the room to prepare beds for the newcomers. When the beds were ready, Chaloner and Grenville retired, and then Edward remained half an hour with Humphrey to communicate to him what had passed. Of course he could not enter into detail, but told him that he would get information from their new guests after he had left, which he must do early in the morning. "And now, Humphrey, my advice is this. My two friends cannot remain in this cottage, for many reasons, but we have the key of Clara's cottage, and they can take up their lodging there, and we can supply them with all they want, until they find means of going abroad, which is their intention. I must be off to the intendant's tomorrow, and the day after I will come over to you. In the meantime our guests can remain here, while you and Pablo prepare the cottage for them, and when I return everything shall be settled, and we will conduct them to it. I do not think there is much danger of their being discovered while they remain there, certainly not so much as if they were here, for we must expect parties of troops in every direction now, as they were when the king's father made his escape from Hampton Court. And now to bed, my good brother, and call me early, for I much fear that I shall not wake up if you do not." The brothers then parted for the night. The next morning, long before their guests were awake, Edward had been called by Humphrey, and found Pablo at the door with his horse. Edward, who had put on his parliamentary accouterments, bade a hasty farewell to them, and set off across the forest to the house of the intendant, where he arrived before they had left their bedrooms. The first person he encountered was, very fortunately, Oswald, who was at his cottage door. Edward beckoned to him, being then about 100 yards off, but Oswald did not recognize him at first, and advanced toward him in a very leisurely manner, to ascertain what the trooper might wish to inquire. But Edward called him Oswald, and that was sufficient. In a few words Edward told him how all was lost, and how he had escaped by changing clothes with one of the enemy. "I am now come to bring the news to the intendant, Oswald. You understand me, of course?" "Of course I do, Master Edward, and will take care that it is well known that you have been fighting by the side of Cromwell all this time. I should recommend you to show yourself in this dress for the remainder of the day,